I'm Sandy Stoddart, or Alexander Stoddart, but I'm not the Queen's sculptor in Ordinary, because the sculptor is the guy that sits about all day in the studio doing nothing, like this. The sculptor is the guy, on the other hand, that runs about doing everything. So I'm the Queen's sculptor in Ordinary in Scotland. How did it all begin? I mean, how was I conceived? I was conceived under a grand piano, which I still have in my house to this day. And I keep it so that when I feel myself, conking out, I'll crawl downstairs and go under the piano and expire where I started off. I suppose I was always an artist one way or another. I'm more in the musical side of things, really, and music's still the big thing otherwise, apart from the sculpture. But I was never great enough in the technical thing. And I also had an aversion to reading music. I hated the look of staff written out, manuscript written out on a page. But there was no technique to allow me to have a professional career as a musician. So I went into the lesser arts of sculpture, painting. Sculpture's not made of hammering and chiselling in that sort of classic notion. It all starts with a clay model, far less glamorous, because there's no hitting involved. It's all very gentle and silent, and doesn't have a dramatic, destructive dimension to it. It's absolutely constructive, and what you're doing is you're lifting quantities of clay from large pieces to tiny pieces onto the form, to build it slowly up, and also to keep the clay model moist. It must never be allowed to dry out. If it does, it just cracks in the armature, like that one there. The point will come in this model, of course, as in every model, that we will abandon the clay model because the negative has been taken off, the mould has been taken from the original clay model. And once the mould is established, the matrix, literally the mother, then we can make casts from that mould in a stable material. What will happen to this work is that it will be cast in plaster and then sent to Italy, where the people at Carrara will proceed to make a marble copy of it. This man here, Schopenhauer, believed that art was there to calm you down, not to stimulate you, but to sedate you. That art sedates the ferocity in us. That's why art often gets attacked, because the ferocity in us knows it's being sedated, so therefore it puts up a special resistance to this. And thus goes and puts a traffic cone in the head of the piece of sculpture, This is a desperate attempt to try to counteract its sedative effect. Who are my inspirations? Well, when I was young and starting sculpture, I used to be inspired by the people that set up an example that wasn't too difficult to follow. See, convenient example. So I was really sold on the sculptor Auguste Rodin. Rodin, he did the Stinker, or the Thinker, sorry, with these honors. And then, actually, I was liking Rodin because it's very rough, and it's also gestural stuff. You can get an effect very quickly with it. And so young men love Rodin because of this. It's also highly carnalized and very erotic in a somewhat dubious way. I was at the Rodin Museum recently in Paris, and I thought how vulgar it all is. It's really kitschy. I made some strange works of sculpture in my life. When I was a young man, I made some abstract sculpture from the point of view of the generality of sculpture in the world, abstract sculpture is one of the strangest things imaginable. And I made some work like that when I was young. I made a pop riveted thing. I made a deck chair at big scale. And then I threw it off a balcony as part of a kind of autodestructive thing. See, this was before I became a traditionalist. You get rid of it that way. Now, this activity is of extreme fascination to some people. That's why you've asked me to do that. Because our desire to destroy statues is absolutely born into us. We're born with it, just as we have a desire to breed and propagate the species. We also have this absolute imperative that one day we will take a hammer to a statue, especially its face. Now, what does this mean? What can it mean? Why is it so compelling? And why do folk desperately want to see me doing that? It's because we have a natural killer instinct in us. And we can when we see that happening, knock, 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 we can't resist smiling in a sort of sense of triumph. It makes great movie footage. The tools are really quite simple. The first set of tools is your hands in a way, because you're just trying to lift clay up onto a surface. But the trouble with finger tools, as you might say, is they're soft and they're circular, tubular, and they tend to, when you try to work with your fingers, it makes a horrible collapsed surface. So for this reason you do resort to tools. Now I use wooden boxwood tools. This is the star of this whole studio here. This is the real spoilt brat of the studio. I worry about where he is at night in my bed, and he never leaves the studio. I've got a terrible superstition about taking tools away from the studio. I think it's deeply bad luck and it should not happen. The other tools are just made out of, that's the handle of a kitchen spatula from Morrison's, cunningly shaped to correspond with what I'm trying to do here. So there's all sorts of tricks. Now some sculptors use steel tools. Bourdelle, for instance, Antoine Bourdelle in France, a very interesting sculptor. Pupil of Rodin, and we chucked Rodin, didn't we all? But he recommended steel tools because he thought that wooden tools they weren't critical enough. But for me, a wooden tool is exactly what you want, because you can reshape it, you can trim it again, and it's gentler than steel. So this is the big statue of the Jesus that I made some years ago, for two and a half years ago, I think, for the chapel in Henley in Thames that Craig Hamilton designed. That's the original plaster model from which the marble copy was cut in Italy, near Pisa, Pietrasanta, down from Carrara. So that's really the most important thing, I suppose, in my oeuvre. The key to it is to understand that this is the plaster copy of the original clay model. The clay model has disappeared, disparu. And what survives is the plaster copy. This goes to Italy, and the men there have a big block of marble that's big enough to take that. And then onto this plaster they put these fixed points. And these are replicated on the marble block over here, right? So 1, 2, 3 is established in the stone. And then by using these three triangular datum points, triangulated datum points, they start to smack in the big quantities of the stone. And then they reduce it down even further using a kind of calibrating implement. And if you look very closely, you'll see that there are small pencil marks, very carefully drawn all over the thing. And these are all points that have been taken to allow the stonemasons to cut the block down to exactly that spot. So that's called the pointing technique, and that's how statuary in stone is made properly. In Stockholm in Sweden, there's an art academy. It's official, it's one of these government official academies producing rubbish. The government approved contemporary art practice rubbish, devoid of any known skill. And a girl there was regarded as the star pupil of all art school education that year because in her degree show, she'd go run into the underground somewhere and faked having a fit. Paramedics go way down, pull her out there with her friend with her, who is surreptitiously filming all this. She gets to accident and emergency, and then she wakes up and she says, well, this has been an artwork. It's to change your perceptions about crises in modern day life. If I had been the junior doctor on call that night at accident and emergency, I'd have headbutted her sharply in the nose and called it art criticism. We've got this kind of problem now in the arts. It's got to be stopped. There's not only a place for classical art, we know what we mean, but it's a term that can't be always used accurately. There's not only a place for it, there's a crying need for it. It's to get back to something wholesome, something testable, something that involves taste and discernment, and something at which you can fail. The art schools nowadays are full of kids being encouraged to do anything. And no matter what they do, it seems to be all right. People say to me, when I advocate classical building and show a picture of the Parthenon in Athens, the great temple, and then there'll be somebody in the audience that will always say, but what relevance does the Parthenon have to us today? And I say to them, the question is not what relevance the Parthenon has to us today. The question, rather, is what do we today have relevant to the Parthenon? What's the relevance of us to the Parthenon? And of course the relevance is completely zero. We are completely irrelevant to the Parthenon. Personally, well, man alone now. And I was terrified of the solitude at first when I became alone. And now I think in solitude I am with everybody. With everybody. You can be with everybody and all things. So alone but with everybody. And the great friends and objects, places, with the sky. And that's a marvellous thing.